Good morning. It's a wonderful Sunday. I hope everyone's doing well. If you're not watching this live, I hope it's going well for you whenever you manage to watch this. Um, Sorry, my wires are all tangled up here. So today we're going to talk about the sort of apologetics of creationism and how to defend it. It was a great question that was posed on this last Thursday's broadcast because we were going through chapter one, well, I guess 1 through 4 of Genesis, trying to tell that story and get the point out of it. And the valid question came up is like, well, but how do you defend this to atheists who are like, hey, uh, it's not real, or even to say someone who's maybe looking at it from a theistic evolution perspective, where God is basically caused the Big Bang and then just works through creation to push things for humanity to evolve. How do you argue these things? So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I have some show and tell aids that may be helpful for a few people. And but like I said, it actually is going to probably. I know I keep saying that it shouldn't take too long, and then we always end up going long. So I'm not even going to say that. But it should be fun, and feel free to ask questions because I think a lot of this is going to be because is going to be exploring a particular way of explaining things that I think may be more useful versus getting into all the science of it. I think it's very easy for us to sort of say, um, think, well, if I just explain, if they're arguing science, and we'll talk about why I put that in quotation marks. I don't know why I put quotation marks in quotation marks. Um, but explaining how we're able to do that, and we think, well, they're using science, we should use science back at them. And really, what I found is here's the problem: they tend to be, when you play that way, one of the problems is they only take the science that they recognize, and that's the trick, right? None of this is actually science versus religion. It's two religious viewpoints versus each other. And I'll go to explain that a little bit more. But that's things we're not really going to focus as much on the science because they tend to. What I found is that most people look to the science that they agree with and they just reject everything else. I think we've seen that this year. Um, Plus, to be honest, the whole science explanation, or sort of defense of atheism, is it's a fig leaf. It is the thing that they put up to sort of hide the naked fact is they don't want to believe in God, and I think that's always the first way to sort of look at all this. When you talk about apologetics in the Bible, we need to understand that people who are non-believers hate God by their very nature. It's just something they can't help. It is where they are. We do make arguments, but it's the Holy Spirit that convinces, that brings them in. Um, so we have to remember that. And ultimately, it's the question is: do you want them to accept that you are right, but then still not necessarily accept Christianity? Which again, that's only the Holy Spirit thing, right? Someone can admit that you're right and not become a Christian. So we have and that's because my point is science can only take you so far. Science is just what we can observe, what we can test. God is not something we can observe or test in a scientific manner. It's a different issue. So we kind of need to remember this argument is fundamentally on a it has this whole argument is fundamentally a fig leaf to hide their naked hatred of God and their desire to not want to come to terms with Him. That's what all this is. And we often forget that. We think, well, if we just make a good argument, then everything will be fine. That's not the case. So we're going to talk about that. Like I said, I do have some show and tells. I think I have some interesting things that we can talk about. Because creationism it's sort of my jam. I love it. And we're going to have some interesting conversations that you may be like, well, man, that's not quite what I heard with this group over here, or this group over here. And it's simply because I've spent my entire life in it, and I've tried to explore a lot of different concepts and explanations, and I've come to some different understandings of some things. So we'll talk about that, but it'll be fun. That's what we're talking about today. So feel free to ask questions, because this is one of those things that comes up a lot, and we need to be able to really have that conversation. Also, we're going to be probably next year, I want to get a few more things together. I want to talk more about ancient astronaut theory, how to discredit it, how to argue against it, so that you can prepare your loved ones and your family. I was thinking about sort of this last week's thing that I did um, on this conjunction that's happening tomorrow, and it's like, really, I think I need to be doing probably a few more videos like that. Maybe not too often, but um, on certain subjects, because I like long form conversations. I don't believe in protesting. I believe in having um, long form conversations, but sometimes quick presentations are the way to go. I just haven't decided if I want to put on this channel or if I want to put on maybe another channel. Because, like I said, I know it sounds weird. I like this channel being small. I think if there was 10,000, 100,000, even 5,000 people, I don't think we'd have the same relationship, right? Like, we pray for MH1953, we can pray for Alan, we can pray for each other if something pops up. Um, and it's one of those things where, once you get too large, you can't have that kind of relationship. So I'm wondering if I want to put those presentations on this channel or another channel. Haven't decided yet. Also, I'm going to be redoing my Ceru Papers website. I just haven't been able to deal with it because it does take a lot of time I just don't have. So my thought is I'm going to try and revamp it to be more of a museum. It's like a digital museum, so that part of what we're going to talk about is when you're having these conversations about cryptozoology, creationism, ancient astronaut theory, ufology. It's like, is there a resource you can send someone to? It's that just lays out the arguments they can go through and go, oh, okay, I didn't know that. I didn't know this. I didn't see this. That's what Ceru Papers will become. It's basically going, like, I'll still have some articles I think I'll, probably more like videos that I'm talking about will eventually get posted there. But for now, I think I need to turn it more into a museum that people can explore and read and, add new arguments to, so they can understand what's happening. Well, you can sit there and say, hey, look at this. This is what you need to be looking for. That kind of a thing. So just some thoughts going on in my head, and sort of where I'm at. Let's go ahead and pray, and I can jump into this. Like I said, ask questions as we go, because I know there's going to be a lot of questions, and this is probably a subject we may explore for a while. Last thought. Since Thursday is Christmas Eve, I will not be here. So we're going to take this Thursday off, but I will be here next Sunday. Because it's Sunday. It's what we do. But yeah, no, this coming Thursday is Christmas Eve. I will be with my family. And I'm Scottish, so we kind of did everything Christmas Eve. It's weird. I'll take a few minutes here. My family always did everything Christmas Eve, opening the presents, like the stocking thing we did in the morning. But that was just like my immediate family, but my larger, the grandparents, the aunts, the uncles, everything was Christmas Eve. We'd go do the candlelight, um, Christmas cantata kind of thing, the service, and then we'd come home and do everything Christmas Eve. It's like, I never believed in Santa Claus. Like, um, yep, exactly, Titan. That's exactly my point. Yeah, it's like, I think probably being on another channel for those presentations is better. But yeah, like, I never believed in Santa Claus. Like, I think that's one of those things where, like, I always knew Santa Claus was like a thing, but he wasn't real, right? Um, I always kind of saw, like, I think my sister and I, we always sort of saw Santa Claus as like the, like when you go to Six Flags and there's a superhero or whatever. Like, we understood that they weren't real. Like, it was sort of this thing. It was an idea. It was a concept, like a game, I guess is how it was explained when I was younger. Like, we never believed in Santa Claus because we did it Christmas Eve. And apparently it's more of a Scottish thing. So anyway, so yeah, we do our things on, Christmas Eve, and then of course Christmas Day. That's when my wife's family gets together, so it was always sort of easier to do it that way anyway. So, not that that's necessarily anything y'all care about, but it just came to mind. Yeah, so, and okay, just while I'm here, I know some people are real big on, some people are like, yeah, Santa Claus is cool and groovy, and people teach their kids about Santa Claus, and they make it real. Others are like, you can't do it. I'm sort of 50-50 on it. I think there's a way to do it, the whole Santa Claus idea, without necessarily making them believe it's real, because I do have the sort of the feeling that when you make a child believe in the Tooth Fairy, the Easter Bunny, Santa Claus, once they learn that that's not real, and everyone knew it wasn't real, and you were being lied to, I think that is a wedge. And think about how often people talk about God and Santa Claus in the same thing. They're like, yep, it's the same thing. So it's one of those deals where I just haven't, but I also don't look down on people who do. I think kids are more resilient than people often give them credit for. I just never did, and I didn't do it with my kids. It wasn't done with me. I tend to think it's probably the safer way to go, to let them know, hey, Santa Claus is this cultural thing. He's make believe. It's a game. Just don't ruin it for the other kids, right? It's like, I tend to think it's more empowering for children because they understand what it is. And then you don't have those. You don't have to lie to them about coming up with stupid questions like why the Santa at the mall smells like alcohol, and why it's never the same Santa twice. You don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. So, just saying. Let's go ahead and open in prayer, and then we'll kick off this conversation about creationism apologetics and where we're going. Yep, Titan. That's exactly right. So exactly, it's one of those things where when it comes to religion, and I don't shy away from the term religion. I was like, oh, it's not about religion; it's relationship. Hold up, religion has meaning. It's about the actions. I'm okay with embracing the word religion. I think we should. But it is one of those things where I'm going to go off on this for a second. And this is going to sound weird, but just I'll come full circle here. It's sort of like what I see in both cryptozoological and ufological and conspiracy groups, even Christian ones, right? It's when you unmoor yourself from what. Hold on, let me put on my glasses so I can see. I'm not praying. There we go. I think what happens oftentimes is once you understand how much you've been lied to from a societal viewpoint, the problem is it becomes very easy to detach. And the problem is once you've unmoored yourself from certain things, you tend to start drifting off, right? And this is where you start getting some of the really wild things instead of like, whoa, 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 whoa. Hold up. Maybe, again, I know it's to some people, they're like, well, why are you sitting on the fence? I'm not a fence sitter. I'm just saying, oftentimes I think that this sort of dualism that we have in any conversation is the problem. I think oftentimes the reality is somewhere maybe in the middle, or maybe it's above or over here, but it's not between these 2 points necessarily. Honestly, I think a great example is Pizzagate. I've talked about this before, and it's sort of, what does Pizzagate and Santa Claus have to do with each other? Just give me a second. I've long felt that Pizzagate itself was disinformation. Now, That being said, doesn't mean it wasn't true. How do I parse that? The two extremes are there's absolutely nothing going on. There is no large group of wealthy, politically connected pedophiles being provided children for sexual exploitation that's being protected by the government or non or seemingly governmental interests. And then over here we have there are these secret tunnels where children are are smuggled through, and satanic ritual sacrifices occur, and it's like these are two extremes. But what did we see with Jeffrey Epstein? They're both true to a point, and here's what I mean. With Jeffrey Epstein, we see a wealthy, politically connected man. I'll be honest, yeah, I think he's probably connected to CIA, maybe Mossad as well. But I think this was a intelligence operation. That's my belief. But it's all hidden. At some point, the truth will come out. But what was he doing? He was supplying underage prostitutes and things like that to wealthy, politically connected individuals. A lot of people, including myself, think that's what the whole Joe Paterno thing was over there with PA. The reason what's his name was able to get away with it, Sandusky was able to get away with it for so long. I can't even believe I remember that dude's name, because it was very much an open secret. In fact, they used to. There was a ice cream shop in town that would serve you what was called a Sandusky, and it was 2 scoops of vanilla ice cream with the cone on a plate with the cone in the middle. Like, this was an open secret about what he was doing, and a lot of people think he was able to get away with it for so long because he was supplying some of these kids. They weren't just for him, but they were for the wealthy donors and alumni who helped support the team, the school. And there is some reason to believe that was the case. So to put this all together, it didn't need Pizzagate was an extreme version of what the reality was. Why? It's deliberate disinformation to get you to discredit the whole idea, right? They give you the truth, but then they blow it up because they disconnect you from reality. Now, does that mean there isn't Satanism, particularly in the CIA, and a lot of these elite? No, I think there absolutely is. There's evidence for it, particularly with, is the CIA doing some weird stuff with things? Oh, absolutely. But oftentimes when we find out the truth, the problem is we tend to go with these other things. We become so unmoored from the reality that it ultimately discredits what's really happening. And oftentimes we miss it. A great video, if you have Amazon Prime, I think it may even be on YouTube, but if you have Amazon Prime, I think they have it on there. It's called Mirage Men. You need to watch it. What it's about are the Air Force intelligence officers who were used to provide disinformation to the ufology community. And the thing is, they only had to give them like a few things, and then the ufologists did the rest. They were on this epic and honest search for the truth, but they were fed just enough lie to, they'd give them some truth, but then they would give them they would just disconnect enough so it'd shoot them going down here, ultimately protecting what they were trying to hide. Also, it gave the CIA, and now they don't really talk about this part, but it gives the CIA and these other organizations cover. When you have these ufologists going out there and it sort of gave them cover to do some other stuff. What does this have to do with Santa Claus? And what does this have to do with this disc? Give me a second. My point here is you find out a little bit, but then you become disconnected. And then what you've ultimately end up doing is either discrediting or you start believing the more extreme things and you miss the actual truth. The truth is almost right there in the public, but you can't see it because you're over here. You've become distracted by the spectacular, not the actual. In the same way, Santa Claus, Easter Bunny, once you start disconnecting, where you're like, well, if this was all a lie, then how do we know this isn't a lie? And this is, once you start disconnecting from these other things, it becomes very easy to sort of drift off. I would argue true evolution, the Darwinian evolution is such a separation from reality that you can't really drag them back in trying to get them to reconnect to these points. You have to deal with a bigger issue, which is God, right? And so that ultimately, I think that's why I was never taught about Santa as a real thing. It's why I didn't teach him, because once you give them someone a reason to separate from sort of that external truth that we can see, hear, maybe talk to other people and say, okay, well, let me hear what you had said. What did you encounter? Once you disconnect from this and from, again, actual science where things can be tested and observed, once you sort of separate from that, once you've unmoored yourself, you go too far. God is truth, right? He's not a lie. He won't lie. He is truth. So the thing about the Bible is you stay with it, and you stay within its confines because you want to be more to a truth. And it's very easy to, Santa isn't real, the Easter Bunny isn't real, the Tooth Fairy isn't real. Then why is God real? And okay, I'm gonna go one more rant. This is also why I'm not really a big fan of things like the story of Noah, Adam and Eve, the old, basically, all these stories being portrayed with cartoon characters, and we sort of we color them for children, right? So it's like, I think turning Jesus and the apostles into a coloring book has a dangerous precedent. It makes it common. In the child's head, it's like, well, I'm going to color this coloring book about Jesus, and then I'm going to color this coloring book about Spider-Man. You've, in that child's mind, equated them, and that only sets them up to be it only sets them up to be let down later on. I do think that there is a point where it's like, no, we're not going to do coloring books about Jesus. We do need to see the high art. We need to see high art about Jesus. They need to recognize that the Old Testament, like, yeah, I think kids can understand how terrible, some of these things were. We don't need to necessarily dwell on them. I do think there's a point of, it's like, you don't, like, here's what a floating, body that's being eaten by crabs looks like. Like, you don't need to do it that way, but you also don't need to make it this cartoon where the kids are like, oh, here's this bathtub shaped thing, and here's the giraffe head sticking out of it. Like, it becomes so cartoony, it's of no value, and I think ultimately undermines the message. But it's sort of off topic, just a thought. And again, I'm not saying you're necessarily wrong or evil for buying your kid a coloring book or your grandchildren a coloring book like that. I just think that maybe we need to rethink, as a culture, we need to rethink how we present these things to children. We do need to show reverence to them, because if they see us showing reverence to these stories and really understand and saying, look at the power of these stories, they will, by watching us, they'll understand that these are things of reverence. These are not, or they're things of reality. They're not Spider-Man. They're not Santa Claus. They're real. These are real human beings, and God is a real being who loves and cares for us and is pained when things happen. Just a thought. Again, completely rambling, but so I think that there is sort of that broader deleterious effect on all of that, which is the lack of respect, lack of awe, but also why we need to remain grounded in reality. Unfortunately, because I think, again, this is where the whole set is like, once you kind of separate yourself from things, then you go off in a la la land, which is like what I think Darwinian evolution is. And we'll discuss this I better wrap this up pretty quick. We'll discuss it in a second. I think this is all Darwinian evolution. Some of these more extreme conspiracy theories are just la la land, when it's like, here's the truth. The truth is right here. It's right in front of you, right? And we need to allow people we have to give them permission to re-more themselves in reality, because God is reality. God is what's real. Jesus is what's real. The Bible is what's real. But we also need to give them permission to recenter themselves in it instead of giving them reasons to disengage. And that's what we're going to talk about today, I guess, fundamentally. Let's open with some quick prayer, and then we'll do a quick presentation. And like I said, any questions you have, we'll try to address. Heavenly Father, we thank you and praise you for all that you've done. We know that you are working. We know that this conjunction that happens tomorrow is a message to us. It's a message of hope that Jesus conquers Satan, that he is so that Satan is no longer the god of this world. It seems like it from our perspective at this point, because of the corruption, of the evil, of the hatred, the violence that we see. But that is not the case. You are the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The earth and all the nations will be made your footstool. They will live under you. You are the one above all, and you will come to bring peace and prosperity to this world. You will bring justice, honesty, fairness. Corruption will be destroyed in your way. We know that that is the ultimate truth. We wait patiently for that day, and we ask only that you make us good ambassadors of that message. We pray that what we discuss today will help us to be better armed so that people will see the error, they will see the spirit of evil of this age and turn towards you and your Holy Spirit. That you will arm us and give us the strength to, in the time of trial and testing, to stand strong and to proclaim the coming of your kingdom. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay, so Apologetics, sort of 101. The easiest and best argument, because I think there's a lot of ways we can go with this as far as attacks I've seen. The first one is Genesis 1 literal, right? And that's sort of what was at the heart of a lot of the questions we had on Thursday night. Is this actually real? Is this literal? And allow me to make the following statement, and just follow me for a moment on this. A statement can be true that's not necessarily telling you, that's not giving you the how. Okay? Science is about how a thing occurs, but what God is talking about is the why. And that's why I do think it was a literal 6 days, but I've even heard an argument that it's both and, or that it's both literal and not literal. Here's why. The speed of light, we've talked, one of the things I mentioned very heavily as to why I think there is at least some degree of science sort of woven into what's happening, and what is definitely a mythological telling of the story. Mythological does not mean false. But I pointed out that time and light were intimately woven together in a way that is both sort of obvious. It's like, well, of course, light in time would have been tied to someone who lived on the earth, because the sun comes up, you have light. The sun goes away, you have darkness. When the moon's up, there's light. When the moon is gone, it's dark. You light fires, you get light. If there's no fire, it's dark. Like time, is set on. You use the moon to tell you what days of the month were, and the sun, and all. So of course this was all tied together. That's obvious. But Genesis 1 makes that point on day 3 or 4, whichever one it is. I can never get them straight. But it makes a different point on day 1, and that's my point. There's no sun, there's no moon. There's just light, and the concept of light, and the concept of darkness. And then they're assigned day, night, and then they're assigned, and what it says in the evening and the day was the first day. So It is tying the concept of light and dark to time itself. That is a very specific point that today we see as interesting, because we know that time is relative to your speed. The closer you get to the speed of light, the more time dilates. Well, if you can travel at the speed of light, which we know we can't, but theoretically, then time would be very, very different. And there is a mathematician who says we know what that dilation is. We can actually chart it. We can do the measurements on it. Now, I'll if I can find the episode that talks about this on the Naked Archaeologist, because they actually talked to the guy who made this presentation. And if I can find something else, I'll share that to the Facebook page, because he does the math and it's fascinating. But he points out that if you were in the center of the universe looking out from the Big Bang at the speed of light, all of the creation of the universe would only take 6 days from your perspective. Because time's dilated, and we have to understand that again, this doesn't make sense to us, and it's kind of hard. This is one of those things where sometimes you have to look at physics and mathematicians and just understand they're talking language that sometimes is a little hard. It's almost as hard to understand as the Bible sometimes, but they can do the math. They know what that time dilation is, and he's like, hey, if you were in the center of the universe and you were just looking out, it would look like the creation up to humanity would only take 6 days. And I find that a really interesting sort of tidbit, because one of the other thoughts I've had is the miracle at Cana. What happened? I know I've mentioned this before, but play with me here. The other thing about Cana, at the wedding of Cana, is that Jesus turned water into wine. He transmuted it from water into wine, which we are told is very, very good wine. It's the best wine. The reason that's important is the best wine takes decades. Sometimes, it takes really decades to do properly, to allow it to ferment, to be handled. So you serve the best wine up front, that gets you all good and liquored up, and your taste buds actually die. Even if you aren't drunk, your taste buds will die. Then you serve the cheap stuff later. You don't notice the difference. That's why the danger of going to a wine tasting, or so I've been told, is by the time you've sampled like wine 3 or 4, they all start tasting really good. You don't have to be drunk. You're not drinking it. You're sampling it. You're spitting it out. It doesn't matter. Your taste buds become less. They become far less capable of determining the different things. I've got plenty of stories of people like, man, I went to this wine tasting. I had what I thought was the greatest wine ever. I bring it home and it's trash. Well, because you bought it at the end. It was a wine that you tasted at the end. Your taste buds couldn't tell the difference. So the fact that he says this is the best wine, the steward, you have to understand the steward wasn't drinking. That's an important thing, because he's saying this is old wine. Jesus instantly transmuted water into a beverage that takes time to make, and it would be mature. Okay, what does this tell us about the nature of the universe? And should Genesis 1 be seen as literal or metaphoric or mythological? Well, here's the problem. Adam wasn't created as a fetus. He was an adult. So was Eve. So are all the animals. They were created adults. The trees would have been whatever a mature tree is. Do we assume they all had the age of 0? No. They would have appeared by any test that you could give to be whatever that mature age was. Right? They would have all been different ages. A mature rabbit doesn't, a rabbit takes longer, or does not take as long to mature as a goat or as a elephant or as a human. So I think what we have is the other problem with all this. It's like, is that when God creates everything, it would have been created the age it needed to be to do what he needed it to do. Doesn't that mean the universe itself is going to appear old? It's going to have gone through the process, or at least by all appearances have gone through the process. So the thing is, God doesn't tell us how he did it. Did it look like 6 days from his perspective, as the mathematician has suggested? Is it just that it did took 6 days, but he made it old, right? So it looked like it was older, so that it had gone through these processes. Howdy, Danielle. Problem is, the Bible doesn't say any of that. It doesn't give us a clue as to that, because that's not its intention. Its intention is to tell us why he created this, why he created the universe, why he created humanity. The why of Genesis 1 is saying God did it, and throwing some shade at the local sort of surrounding religions by saying he didn't have to conquer chaos. There was no chaos. He was already over it because he's God. Again, it's a temple text. It goes through 7 days of order and of creating this universe, because the universe is supposed to be God's temple that he rests in with humanity, right? So I have heard about that. Unfortunately, I've not had a chance to research it, but yeah, the light itself can be stretched. There's a lot of weird things. Like I said, we're finding weird things out there. And this is one of those things where, again, as we become more advanced, we're seeing different patterns in the biblical text that sort of change how we should be reading it. Again, I go back to when you look at the Dagon, yeah, it's the Dagons. When you look at this African culture that appears to have been descended from the Egyptian priests, you look at the oddities of their language. You're like, hold on, maybe when it talks about the waters, right, in Genesis 1, that it means this fluidic energy. Maybe it's not necessarily meaning actual water. It carries a higher meaning in certain contexts, because Hebrew is a high context language. It's possible Moses knew that and may have taught that to the original Israelites, but it just doesn't pass down, unfortunately, for a number of reasons. So, but the broader point here is the text can be true, but still not necessarily give you the how. I just gave you 3 or 4 options here that do kind of work with the text. You don't betray the text in any way, and it is what it is, right? Like, theistic evolution does not necessarily betray the text when you talk about this, the speed of light kind of concept and time dilation. If he creates the universe old, how would we know? Like, the problem is we get caught up in arguing over the how. Genesis 1 is about why. Why does he do this? Not necessarily the how. And we have to admit, it is written in mythological language, and that's not a problem. That's how the people thought, right? It's sort of like, and I've used this metaphor before, but I think this is really a great point. Imagine 2 people are arguing over NASCAR. I don't care about NASCAR one way or the other. My father loved it, went to races whenever he could, because he was a car guy. I'm a bigger fan of drag races, but that's a different thing. But like NASCAR, imagine 2 people are sitting down arguing over NASCAR. One guy wants to only talk about the physics of the traction of the tires, wants to talk about the chemical composition of the tires, wants to talk about the engine, how they're manufactured, how the how they're refining the combustion for maximum torque, these kinds of things. That's what he's talking about. The other guy is talking about the rules of NASCAR, how the driver's supposed to respond, how what it takes to win. And they're arguing as if these are oppositional concepts. We'd look at them as if they were stark raving crazy. It's like, well, yeah, how the car works is important. How it goes around the track is important. Understanding it is good for creating a safer car, a more efficient car. These are important things, but that's not why they're going around the track. And the same point, why they go around the track is also not how they go around the track, right? So we would look at this argument as if it was patently insane, because it is. The problem is what we have is not science versus religion. What we have are two religions arguing over the how, really. Because one side wants to argue a how, but what they're really arguing is that there is no God, because all of the hows that they have are predicated on the idea that there is no God orchestrating everything. Because even if you were to include the idea of, Michael Crichton even talks about this, theistic evolution is just as much creationism as young earth creationism. And at first it seems sort of counterintuitive, but Michael Crichton's whole point is, if there is something, whether somebody just says, boom, planets, people, go have fun, or they work through physics, through evolution to come to a point, is irrelevant, because there's still something making it happen. Darwinian evolution is chance. It is random. It has no thing of intelligence moving it forward. So they're trying to use how to argue a religious viewpoint, which is that there is no God. The other side is saying no, that there is a God. And the problem is the Bible, which is really what you're arguing from, is about the why, not the how. It's about, again, it's why the cars go around the track, not how they do. So this goes back to why I started at the beginning. I mentioned science isn't really what this is about. It's about religious viewpoint. It's just the science, sorry, it's this hand. The science that is argued is really just a fig leaf for their not wanting to be a god. That's all it is. It's sort of like saying, I want to focus on the cars and the physics of the cars and how the cars are comprised, because I don't want there to be a driver. Which, again, is patently insane. So the best apologetic is just to avoid that first argument and say, look, there's a lot of ways in which this works. Theistic evolution is still creationism. 6-day creationism, you wouldn't know the difference, because he would have made everything old. It would appear old. Any test that you could give would appear old. Just like he did with the water at Cana, which turned into wine at Cana. So how is not a fundamentally, it's not like it sounds like I'm saying, well, then we can't know these things. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the fight is not there. The fight is over the why. And this is where things get interesting, because if the Darwinian perspective is right, then there are certain things we should expect to see. If the biblical worldview is correct, then there are things we should expect to see. And this is where, if you do want to get into the argument for it, just say, look, here's the problem. Modern science ain't always playing straight with us. They do hide things. This is where cryptozoology, forbidden archaeology, becomes so important, because they are evidence that ultimately the biblical worldview is correct. Now, I mentioned I had some show and tell. We've talked about the cryptozoology and all this stuff before, so that's why I want to talk about the forbidden archaeology. And I can announce this. What I'm about to show you, or at least two of the artifacts I'm about to show you, you can actually buy. They're casts off the original, made by Joe Taylor. When you see those elongated skulls on like the History Channel and Creation points that talk about these weird elongated skulls that don't have the sagittal suture, he's the one who makes them. He actually he was actually the one who cast those skulls down in Peru with L.A. Marzulli. I know him. He's a friend of mine. I'm helping him create a thing. You're going to be able to buy a kit that has both artifacts, as well as a 5 booklets, full color booklets of 8 pages that make the argument for you. They will also have a thumb drive where you can actually print off as many as you want, color, black and white. There's displays, so you can basically create like this little creation science corner, like at a church or in your office, wherever, right? And you can hand out materials, those kinds of things. That's going to come. That's going to be available next year. We'll talk about it more on Texas channel. But yeah, so these things you can find, and you can actually obtain them from Joe Taylor himself. This one, actually, let me start with this one. It's basically just called Iron Pot and Coal, and it's a cup. Now, the thing is, the actual cup is both these artifacts are at the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose. Talk to Dr. Baugh. And because I worked on this project with him and Joe Taylor, I get a chance to see a lot of this stuff up close, including the tests for it. There's nothing unusual about this particular pot. By the way, the pot itself is not actually in coal. This was done as sort of just to let you know that it's not just an iron pot. Like it was found within this coal, which is why it's important. A lot of people have argued that this pot is actually just a new artifact that basically was something that a miner used, and it fell into some coal dust that compressed and then got sold. It happens from time to time. But the problem is the gentleman who found it, because it was sold as a giant lump of coal, he said that that's not what it looked like, that this looked like coal. It was just a block of coal. He was breaking it up to use in a furnace, and he found it. There was impressed and everything inside that coal. So he basically made it sound like, yeah, no, this was coal that he found. It wasn't a compressed block. Secondly, we can't, if this were to be something that one of the miners used, we do know it's cast iron, it's what it is, then we should be able to find something that looks exactly like it. And we can't. You see, when things are mass produced, you have other versions of it, right? You can find it. And some people might say, but it's an iron cup and it has those things. Like we find them all the time. Well, we find things that look like it, yeah. But guess what? That shape goes back thousands of years. This is not an unusual shape for a bowl to be in. And because, let's face it, how many shapes can a bowl have? You see, the thing, the trick here is we should be able to find people. I think this, if I recall properly, this came on the Tennessee Valley mine. We should be able to find other cups that look exactly like it, and we don't. We can't. We can find things that are kind of similar, but oftentimes with these, they all had handles because they were ladles, right? That's how they were used. You draw the water. We can't find anything just exactly like this. And if it was a mass-produced item used by poor miners, we'd see more of them, and we don't. And if this were the only thing, you could still write it off. Just say, okay, maybe it was a one-off thing. All right. But then how do you explain the nails? How do you explain the bronze bell? We find metallic artifacts in coal all the time. These reports go back centuries. As long as we've been harvesting coal, we have found out-of-place artifacts within that coal. And why does that make sense? Why should we expect to find out-of-place metallic objects in coal? Well, there's dust on it. Coal is made from peat, trees. It's organic matter. It's been compressed. Well, if you're living in the pre-flood age, where would you live? Where you have water and food and trees to make things out of. Does that make the most sense? What happened? These coal mines aren't the byproduct of millions and millions of years. coal can actually be formed. In fact, we find wood converting to coal at the bottom of these older wooden bridges. They have started to coalify. It takes pressure, and it does take some time, but mostly pressure. Well, during the flood, we have what's called liquefaction, where the essentially, we actually saw it up in Alaska in the 50s. There was a massive earthquake, and what happened is the softer, more is usually compacted soil and rock, essentially sort of turns to, because sort of gets uncongealed, and it sort of flips things like the land just plump, like this. It's insane, but that is probably what happened to form a lot of these coal beds. You had these peat bogs, and all these massive coniferous trees. During the flood, you have this major tectonic event, and they get dropped low. Rocks get, and then the other land gets shoved up on top of it. Right? It's instantly compressed. Well, the people who lived there, who had artifacts there, some of that stuff would have survived. A lot of these metallic artifacts would have survived. That's what we find. That's why we find bells. That's why we find nails. That's why we find things like this in that coal, because they were there when the coal was formed. Second, my favorite artifact, the London hammer. You have seen this in all over the internet, probably. If you looked into this, man, I got to dust these things. But you've probably been sold a bill of goods on it, because there's a lot of lies about this particular hammer. So as someone who's actually seen the experiments done on it, I've seen the x-rays, I can tell you, and the chemical analysis, I can tell you what the truth is. And you can actually find this in the booklets of things, when you buy this museum in a box kit. So here's the thing about the London hammer. The strata it was supposedly found in, or that it was found in, is thought to be 200 plus million years old. Now, some people have said, well, what happened is, because it's Kalachi, it was found in Texas, London, Texas, literally in the middle of nowhere. Even today, it's in the middle of nowhere. It was found in the creek there. Is that Kalachi is basically highly it's basically just carbonate. Is that it would have become lost? It would have just been, so what most people tell you is it's a modern hammer that got lost, and essentially a bunch of this 200 million year old rock got dissolved and just reformed around the hammer to be found in the 1930s. Well, first problem is that doesn't look like any hammer manufactured since the 1600s. I know. I've reached out to, and I can't believe this is a thing, hammer experts. It's a thing. It's a thing. No one can show me any hammers that look like this. Secondly, London, Texas is still literally the middle of nowhere. So having some, like, most often they'll show this and say, well, look at this masonry hammer, which is this large, almost like sledgehammer. And they're like, well, it looks kind of like that, so it must be the same thing. That's not the same thing. They have different purposes. This, I don't know if you can really see it, but you can kind of see how it has, let me get a little bit closer in the light. You see that how it has these sort of, four bumps here, right? These are, let's see if I can, it has these four raised points. It's going to be very hard to see here, but here on the very tip, there's this raised area in the center. Given its size and these odd, these sort of odd forms in the end, a lot of people have speculated that this is actually a metalsmithing hammer, but a soft, fine working metalsmith's hammer, like making jewelry or small statuaries, things like that. This is not a hammer brought by the average blacksmith or some early Texas explorer. This is not the kind of hammer you would have brought. So We can't find any hammers that look like this ever. We also don't see any reason for someone to have a hammer like this in London, Texas, ever. But then, thirdly, and this is the most important part, it doesn't rust. And it doesn't rust because it was made using chlorine. And this is the big thing. A lot of people have lied about. They will. A lot of these lies about this hammer will be, oh, the claim that Dr. Bond and them make is that it's a very pure kind of iron, and that's no. No one has ever made a claim to say the purity of the iron is why it's exotic. That's not the case. That's a lie. The reason this hammer is bizarre is because they uses chlorine to create this external coating. It doesn't rust because it uses a ferrous oxide coating. It's sort of like creating a stable rusted outer coating so that it doesn't rust all the way through. That's the idea. But they uses which, by the way, is used. That's done all the time. But this hammer used chlorine, or whoever made it bonded chlorine to the iron. And this is why it's interesting. Chlorine is highly reactive to iron. This shouldn't exist. I spoke with metalsmiths and, I'm sorry, not metalsmiths, metallurgical experts. I spoke with corrosion experts when I was doing my research for all these things. Again, not a lot of people want to go on record about this. So I had a chance to talk to him. I had to talk to him, just say I was doing an article, which was true. I didn't tell him what it was necessarily for. But I asked him if it was possible to create a ferrous oxide coating, a stable ferrous oxide coating that would prevent a tool from rusting, or an iron tool from rusting using chlorine. They said to the person, absolutely it's possible. I said, okay, great. How would you do this? Not one of them had an answer. They said, yeah, it's theoretically possible, but we don't know how you would do it. So what we have is a hammer that has no counterpart, as near as we can tell, found in a place that makes no sense to have this kind of hammer, made out of material nobody can explain, in rock that's supposed to be 200 million years old. By the way, we know the hammer was there for a while because this handle has partially coalified. It's not turned to coal, but it's partially coalified. So this right here, and you can look, there are plenty of out-of-place artifacts. This is it. This is the reason that you can look and say, nope, you got to explain this better to me. Well, how do we have a material or a hammer made of material you can't explain in a place that makes no sense? But it does make sense. This is a pre-flood artifact that just happened to be found. That's it. Now, one of the things you'll see in the booklet and the presentations that's part of that, and I'll put them up on the series papers when I make it an official sort of museum website, are the human footprints found in the same strata as dinosaurs, as well as the ones where a human has stepped into a dinosaur track, and another one where a dinosaur has stepped into a human track. Those are real tracks. They're not carved. We've got the CT scans where they actually did the layers, and it's like, nope, these things are compressed. These are compression layers. This wasn't carved. But I didn't want to talk about that now. We'll talk about this. This is a fish fossil. I bought it for $40. These are a dime a dozen, literally. You can buy trilobite fossils from Joe Taylor for $5 a pop. Fish fossils are everywhere. They're basically, you can buy them. Like I said, you can buy them cheap because there's so many. It's almost, heck, living here in Texas, I don't even care necessarily about fossils in aquatic fossils in limestone, because it's all I have. It's everywhere. The Natural History Museum, it used to be, now it's something else, but the walls are made out of limestone that was quarried nearby, and they are full of uh, shells of all in different kinds of aquatic life, because that's what's in there. It's what the limestone was made out of. It was compressed, and you have these little tiny seashells everywhere. And in fact, it was very common to just make things out of them 50, 60 years ago here in Dallas, because it was pretty. We're like, well, we got them everywhere. We'll just slice them and throw them up on the wall. That's what we did. So why am I using this? I mean, I just showed you an art, or at least a recreation of an artifact that makes no sense. Why am I focusing on a cheap, almost universally found fish fossil? Well, because this fish fossil represents literally millions and millions of fish fossils. It represents fossils of marine reptiles giving live birth. Not one, not two fossils like that, dozens of fossils like that. Dozens of fossils of a bigger fish eating a smaller fish. There are millions and millions and millions of fish fossils just like this. Some frozen in the act of eating another fish, some some marine animals in the process of giving birth to giving live birth. But it's everywhere, all over the planet. These are not fish that died, had their bodies then they just settled to the bottom, and then no. All of these represent fish that were alive in almost instantly crushed in the process of what they were doing, and fossilized very quickly. That's why we have clams that are still fossilized, shut. This fish, this fossil, is the best proof of a global cataclysmic event, because having maybe one fossil of a marine reptile giving birth, okay, you could explain that away. But millions of whole schools of fish just being fish, instantly pressed, like you'd press a flower in a book, preserving them. Same thing with these massive, I mean, quite large marine reptiles. Instantly, just that requires a cataclysmic event that spans the globe. I know you're saying, but Jason, this is all Genesis 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stuff. This isn't Genesis 1 stuff, but it is. As I pointed out, the problem with Genesis 1 is it is written in a mythological style. It has a theological point. Doesn't make it not true. It's just not focused on the way we would care about it. It has a bigger purpose. It's showing us what God is, what God wants the universe to look like. Peaceful, useful, good, with Him resting with us. That's what it's supposed to be. That's the point. I've explained the how may be very difficult to understand and explain when we've got numerous reasons. Again, guided evolution, though I don't necessarily subscribe to it, but that doesn't necessarily run counter to the text. 6-day creationism. Well, if He made it old, we'd never be able to tell the difference. So that's sort of an invalid. So there's no room to work that, right? But the biblical worldview, regardless of the ages, is that there was a perfect time where everything was healthy. It was diverse. It was perfect, an optimal environment. That included humans. There was a catastrophic event. The earth was entirely disrupted and only a handful of humans and animals survived. That's the worldview. If that worldview is right, we should expect to find artifacts that make no sense, like a hammer that doesn't rust in rock that's 200 million years old. 200 million. We should find evidence of a global cataclysmic aquatic event, like a flood. We should expect to find evidence of humanity during this earlier age. Human footprints in the same strata we have dinosaur footprints. We should also expect to find, and this is where cryptozoology before I get to that point, we should expect that all the animals alive today should A, have relatives from before that time, which we find, and we should expect them to be less robust and maybe even less diverse than what we find before. We find that. We should also expect to find a handful of animals that don't fit in today's world. These were creatures that never really adapted. Maybe they adapted a little bit, but they still remained in a form similar to what they were before the cataclysm. And to our eyes would appear like creatures that belonged back then. These are your myths of your dragons, of Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster. All these things are just relic populations of animals that existed prior to the flood. They joined us, but they were just weird, right? They didn't become as ubiquitous as, say, a finch or storks or cats or dogs, right? They grew, they existed, but they always stayed in relatively small populations and they remained relatively unchanged. These are your pterosaurs. They become dragons. You have other critters running around that become dragons as well in our language. We only know them as dinosaurs today because we live in a different age. So this is the better argument. It's just say, look, forget the times, and when we get to like this guy was so old and then he died, we're going to talk about all that. There is, while again the argument is these are true genealogies, they're not necessarily complete, and the numbers are designed to create a different meaning. They're not necessarily meant to be taken as a literal age. We'll talk about that. Again, it doesn't make it untrue, actually. It just means it had a different purpose. So get rid of the time frames and just say, what are the succession? What are the events, right? What are the order of events? What would you expect? Well, we have actual, what we have are the things that we actually see, the cryptids, the out of place artifacts, things like this are what we expect to find. And that's the big thing. Science is about what you can actually observe. What we actually observe when we see all the evidence is evidence of a worldwide flood, or at least you can call it a flood, but a worldwide catastrophic event that wiped out a lot of animals and wiped out a prior civilization. We find their artifacts. This is what we find. That's science. Science is going and digging up artifacts like that and saying, hey, this is weird. This doesn't belong. What's up with this? Science, though, or modern science, likes to look at these things and say, we don't want to talk about it. It must be fake. No reason to believe it's fake. No evidence ever given as to why it should be considered fake, but just declared fake. Why? Because it's not about science. It's not really about science. It's about the world view. It's about the religious view, as I said before. Ain't none of this about science. It isn't science versus religion. It's two religious viewpoints opposing one another. We have to be able to get past the fig leaf argument and get to the real argument. Just point out Genesis 1 is about a message, not necessarily the how. It's about the why. So, and then you can give them more reason, and then all the reasons I've given, to just throw out that entire argument. Just don't even engage in it and say, but you want to talk about science. Let me talk about the biblical worldview. What are the basic premises that the Bible is predicated on? Do we find evidence that supports that narrative? Yes, we do. And starting next year, like I said, I'm working to make Siri Papers a more, basically just to make it a museum. I'm trying to get all these other projects out of the way so I can just focus on that for a little bit. But that way you can have this conversation with atheists or people who maybe are non-believers for whatever reason and say, look, here's my argument. Now, you want to see if you want to see evidence for it, go here. You want to talk about the evidence for a cataclysmic event? Here it is. You want to talk about artifacts that don't belong? Here it is. You want to talk about cryptozoology being evidence of the flood? Here it is. All of these things. Because, like I said, the science is only a fig leaf. But what we can do is you strip that fig leaf away, expose what they're really talking about, but then you follow it up with some science. That's what you do. Remove the fig leaf, strike the fact they just don't want there to be a God. Then you follow it up with the science. So, we're at 1:11, an hour and 11 minutes. So, and that's really what I wanted to say. So it did take longer, but that's because I was ranting about other things. We'll probably end up continuing this thought next week as far as continuing this creationist argument, because there's a lot here. We need to be able to argue for creationism, not necessarily just young Earth creationist. I am a young Earth creationist, but again, I throw a little caveat. I do throw a few caveats in there, but it's I'm still a young Earth creationist, and we need to be able to make the argument for it. But we also need to remember that this is not really the argument. This is just being able to avoid the fig leaf. The real argument is that in the hearts and minds of many people, they just don't want to believe in God, and they're clinging to things that allow them to get away with saying, well, I just don't see any evidence for it. That's all this is about. That's all this is. So we're going to talk about this, and we're going to talk more about ancient astronaut theory, how to sort of refute it a little bit, and how to argue with it, because that's the new religion. That's the religion of the 21st century, and it's on the rise. And I do, as I've mentioned many times, I do think that will tie into the Antichrist. I think that is the religion that allows the Antichrist to sort of unite all the rest. So I think going into 2021, we're going to talk a lot more about this. And then at some point, maybe towards the summer of 2021, we should have, I'd like to get done sooner, but I'm trying to set a realistic expectation considering my work schedule. Have Siri Papers redone as a museum. And like I said, we'll create some videos. Oh yes. Okay. Well, the Bible was written by man argument. You know what? That's a great point. I think that will be, we'll talk about that next week. Ty, I think that's a great point, because I've actually talked about that in the past, but not necessarily in this context. But yeah, like I said, hopefully by the summer of 2021, I can have Siri Papers sort of redone, and I can start doing videos that are shorter, but explore, again, how to argue for these things, how to counter ancient astronaut theory, how to counter someone who says the Bible was only written by people, that kind of thing. So those are the goals. As I mentioned before, I won't be here Thursday because Thursday's Christmas Eve. So Merry Christmas. And Sunday, and then I will be here next Sunday as a follow-up. I may do another broadcast. It just depends on how the week goes. Maybe talking about Christmas. It's not really a big deal for me one way or the other, but some people are anti-Christmas, and I don't blame them per se. I may do that. It just depends on how the week goes. But definitely, I will be here this next Sunday. We'll talk about that. I like the, Bible was only written by man question, and combining it with this idea of creation and apologetics. So we'll talk about that. Until then, remember to pray for one another. Let's pray for this nation. Let's pray for God's strength to be the witness He wants us to be in the world in which we find ourselves. Until then, I will bid you, good people, adieu. And just remember, I'm praying for you as well. Have a good one.